This episode is brought to you by Bowers Wilkins, makers of the PI8 True Wireless IEM. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
Today we are going to talk about my favourite hi-fi products of 2024, and I've been saving all 4 of these award winners for this video. So in other words, I'm going to do 4 mini reviews in a single video. So let's get started. The MIAD-01 is a 5G smartphone from China's Moondrop, and it has been explicitly designed for those who care about the sound quality of wired headphones. And MIAD is short for Mobile Internet Audio Device. Now, this phone isn't a rebadged model from a third-party supplier. I asked Moondrop and they told me they make the MIAD-01 themselves. So the shell here is all plastic, and the display, I think it's a 120Hz 1080p OLED panel. It's very easy on the eyes, and underneath that screen sits a fingerprint reader, which isn't always reliable, but it misses far less than the fingerprint reader that I had on a Google Pixel 6 Pro a couple of years ago. Of course, it wouldn't be a modern day smartphone without front and rear facing cameras, and on its website, quite bizarrely, Moondrop says that the camera is not good, but it works. And I think they're selling themselves short here, because whilst the photo quality isn't great in the way that, say, photos coming off my Asus Zenfone 10 are great, they're still okay. Well, as long as the lighting is decent, because nighttime photos on the Moondrop are much more of a mixed bag. And the rear camera's protruded housing means the MIAD-01 isn't really all that comfortable to hold for a long period. Now, phone nerds will want to know that the Android 13 operating system here runs on an 8-core MediaTek, Dimensity 7050, something like that? And that's assisted by 12 gigs of RAM. Now, Western buyers will need to activate Google services in the settings to get their access to the Google Play Store for access then to streaming apps. So we can install Spotify, Tidal, Cobas, Apple Music, all of that stuff. But for anyone still rocking a micro SD card full of FLACs and or MP3s, the MIAD-01 has a slot for you, although I think it only supports cards up to 2 terabytes. Otherwise, we are restricted to the 256 gig of internal storage to host our FLAC collection or offline content. So for me, one fundamental advantage of using streaming apps like Tidal, Apple Music, Plexamp and Roon is that offline content can come and go and come back with the click of a button. Now, Moondrop also tells me that the MIAD-01's 5,000 milliamp hour battery, I think I've got that right, is capable of 27 hours of runtime between charges. But in my testing, I was lucky to hit 16 hours. Now, Sony models aside, that's still more than your average portable player, which is lucky to make it over 10 hours. But on the upside, the MIAD-01 takes just over an hour to fully recharge from empty, but I don't think it supports wireless recharging. But let's talk about what makes this phone special for audiophiles. So first of all, digital audio signals are routed around Android's sample rate converter for fully bit-perfect playback with most apps. But I don't think that's anywhere near as important as the DA converter inside the phone, which is built around a pair of Cirrus Logic chips. And that DAC circuit outputs via 2 different headphone sockets. So there's a 3.5mm single-ended and my preference a 4.4mm balanced socket. And according to Moondrop, we get up to 250 milliwatts per channel, but I guess that will only come from the balanced output. I'm guessing there, you'll have to check for yourself whether that's true or not. Now on sound quality, I think the Moondrop phone runs rings around the Sony Xperia 1 Mark V and most likely the Sony Xperia 1 Mark VI, because it better separates instrumental layers to make music sound more internally spacious and sort of bigger in all directions. And there's a commanding heft and weight to the sound that I don't hear from the now long discontinued LG V40, which I think was the previous smartphone that sort of captured the audiophile space. And I think that LG V40 compared to the Moondrop sounds slightly thinner and wirier than the Moondrop. And every time I pick up the Moondrop phone to listen to music, usually actually this year with the Campfire Astrolith and the Sennheiser IE300, I'm just kind of blown away by how good it sounds. Because the MIAD-01 is especially adept at keeping the IE900's livelier top end on a tighter leash. It just makes music sound, I know this is going to sound corny, but this is how it sounds to me. It makes music sound more beautiful than, say, any dongle DAC that I've applied to the Sony phone or the Asus phone. And the only reason the Moondrop isn't yet my daily driver smartphone is that Google Maps doesn't work. So my Moondrop contact tells me that his software team is aware of the Google Maps issue and is working on a fix, and that fix will come over the air in the next firmware update, but we don't have an ETA on that. But in the meantime, it might be useful to see the MIAD-01 as a portable audio player with smartphone functionality. And right now, I think it's operating in a field of one. And that's reason enough to call it one of my favorite products of 2024. Now for that Moondrop smartphone, we're probably going to need a pair of IEMs because I think it's more of an outdoor device than it is an indoor device. And I think my favorite IEM of this year is the Clara from Campfire Audio, which is actually a collaboration with Alessandro Cortini. And Cortini is, full disclosure here, he's a friend of mine. And he is the bass and synth player in Nine Inch Nails. He's also a solo electronic musician. I like his solo work more than Nine Inch Nails. I'm not really a Nine Inch Nails fan. So these two parties have come together to produce an IEM. And the Clara come wrapped in packaging that heavily reflects, quite literally, the sleeve artwork found on Cortini's latest album, Nati Infiniti. And as regular Darko Audio podcast listeners will know, Alessandro Cortini already had an extensive Campfire Audio IEM collection before this collaboration. But at the end of 2023, he wondered out loud to me if Ken Ball, so that's Campfire's founder, would be interested in collaborating on a new IEM model. So Ball would take care of design and production, and Cortini would determine the shell type and the overall sound. Now, from speaking to Alessandro, I know that he is very attached to the Bonneville IEM from Campfire and also the Solaris in its many iterations. But I know that he prefers the Bonneville's ear shell because it feels, well, he told me it feels more of the outer ear than the classic Campfire models like the Andromeda. And it isn't as bulbous, doesn't stick out as much as any of the Solaris. So he says that the Bonneville fits closest to a custom model. Well, that's what he told me actually over a cup of coffee about 3 weeks ago here in Berlin, because he was in town to perform a new show at Silent Green, and he used a pair of Clara to monitor his audio on stage. That's one of the reasons he wanted to do this collaboration. It isn't just to make earphones for listening to music, but also for professional musicians. Now the Clara's shell is made from acrylic and it fills the outer ear as intended, it's just so, and you put it in and it stays in without requiring any sort of reseating or readjustment, and you can't say that about the Solaris. And the Clara also offers above average levels of passive noise isolation, just like the Bonneville and the Astrolith. And I know this because Cortini lent me 2 pairs of Clara during my last month-long trip to Lisbon. Now the second pair was a more costly limited edition version whose earpiece is made of titanium. And I warn you, these earphones do not come cheap. It's $2,000 for the acrylic model and $3,000 for titanium, that's US dollars. Now, I didn't hear any sort of night and day differences between the 2 versions. One did not destroy the other. And I think you probably just buy the titanium one because you want titanium, or because you want its fancier cable, or because you want, I think, a slightly different dongle DAC in the box, but I'm not sure on that. But I had to listen very hard for any audible differences. And the bass kicks hard on both, but not too hard. There isn't as much in-your-face physicality as the more V-shaped Bonneville. Now, Cortini told me that he really likes the sound of hybrid designs, mainly for their superior bass weight and bloom, and that, he says, gives him a more emotional connection to the music. And both the Solaris and the Bonneville are hybrid designs. But there's a bit of a catch here, because Alessandro says that the insistent treble heard on many IEMs keeps his onstage volume control, like lower than he would like. And he says that he often finds that the hotter treble, or the more insistent treble, or the more present treble, whatever you want to call it, he finds that quite distracting in the long run. So park that thought, because we'll be coming back to it in a moment. Now, inside Clara's earpieces, we find a hybrid driver array. So that means a dual magnet dynamic biocellulose driver for the bass, then a dual balanced armature driver from Knowles for the mids, and then another dual balanced armature driver from Knowles for the highs. Now the drivers crossover, along with Campfire Audio's tuned acoustic expansion chamber, allowed Cortini and Ken Ball to voice the Clara long distance over a 12-month period. So Cortini would test each iteration on stage and at home with his collection of high-end DAPs, and boy does he have a lot of DAPs. And he would then send feedback to Ball, and then Ball would then dial in a new pair and send them to Cortini for more feedback. So you can see how the feedback loop works there. Now, Alessandro told me over that same coffee just down the road at Talish's tour that he didn't want to make the Clara sound muffled or dark, but on the other hand, he wanted less of an emphasis on the highs, on the uppermost treble. Remember how he said before that it annoys him, really, I think. I don't know, I don't want to put words in the guy's mouth, but yeah, I don't think he loves it all that much. So the sound on the Clara is not as instantly energized with hi-hats and, say, guitar squalls as the Bonneville or the Astrolith, or for that matter, the Sennheiser IE300. So switching back to the Astrolith and that Sennheiser after a month with the Clara was, I gotta say, somewhat of a shock. And it took me almost a day to sort of reacclimatize to their zippier and zingier handling of higher frequencies. And I gotta say, I didn't love them as much. And this woke me up to the idea that a more relaxed treble gives us a better look at mid-range depth. So my Lisbon listening was done with that Asus Zenfone 10 with a FiiO KA2 dongle DAC, but also an SP3000T DAP from Aslan that Alessandro lent me. Now, back in Berlin with a second Clara loaner, I double-checked my findings during the last 3 weeks with the Moondrop MIAD-01 smartphone. And as I said about the Meze 105 Air last week, a less energized top end gives the ear brain more mental space, to hear into the mid-range's deeper recesses. I feel like I'm repeating myself here. I am, aren't I, really? But yeah, if you have less up here, you can see more here, if that makes sense. Probably doesn't, but that's the way I hear it. But in the case of the Clara, this means better organized player placement on the head stage than the IE300, despite the Clara's head stage not being quite as wide as the Sennheiser. And the Clara doesn't sound as full-bodied as the full-size Meze 105 Air, but comparing an IEM to an open-backed over-ear, yeah, it's a bit silly, isn't it? Especially as the Clara goes out into the street and onto public transport with ease, and the Meze does not, especially if you care about bulk and not disturbing other people. But hopefully you catch my drift here, that less treble insistence for some listeners makes for a more immersive listening experience. And I think the Clara contrasts many other IEMs, including Campfire's own IEMs, as having too much top-end pizzazz. And this feature alone marks them out as one of my favorite pieces of audio hardware for 2024. But if you don't want to spend big money on IEMs, and I can't say I would blame you, then you might want to experiment with headphone EQ. And that's what this next product, is it a product? Kind of is a product. That's what this next thing is all about, because OPRA is the name of the new headphone EQ functionality recently folded into Roon. Now you can find it in the desktop app, but I've been using OPRA inside the Roon Arc app. That's the one that runs on the smartphone or the iPad for, I guess it's intended for portable audio use, but I guess not exclusively, as we'll see. Anyway, this is not just a new feature, but a front end to a community-driven project whose behind-the-scenes thinking, yeah, it has two prongs to it, right? So the first is that headphone manufacturers can only take their designs so far before any incremental improvements become prohibitively expensive. So DSP-powered EQ can pick up where that expense prohibition leaves off. And secondly, instead of users manually applying numerous EQ settings to their favorite headphones, often like one frequency band at a time, OPRA lets us apply headphone EQ with just 2 clicks. So we choose our headphone model and then our preferred EQ preset, and that's it. And that preset often comes from a long time respected source. So I started out with OPRA, some weeks ago with the Sony MDR 7506 closeback. That's a very affordable headphone. It's nothing fancy. And the Oratory 1990 preset gave me a smoother, better balanced sound overall with fewer noticeable bumps and dips in the frequency response. You could absolutely hear them. But the volume drop that we hear when we turn the EQ on is a side effect of that EQ, which I think dents the reliability of any sort of quick fire on-off side-by-side comparisons. So I say we have to listen for longer, but also in the Sony's case, to its 3 other OPRA presets. So the headphone.com legacy preset, I think, is too bass heavy for my tastes. And that's an abrupt reminder that we all have different listening preferences. And because we find more than one EQ preset in many a headphone's OPRA submenu, also reminds us that the headphone measurement process is not 100% objective. And I'll let Drew from Moon Audio explain why.
The audio precision equipment, extremely expensive measurement equipment, and people like Jude Mansell at HeadFi have this setup, which is uber expensive. Well, there are a lot of folks on YouTube and writing blogs that are using makeshift measurement studios in their house with, you know, pieces of cardboard and microphones. I'm going off the extreme here, right? But they're not using to the level of quality like Jude is and some of the really high-end measurement folks are using. And so this can really paint a bad picture on what potentially a headphone can measure like as well as sound like.
So each EQ preset found inside Opera is built around 2, sometimes 3 elements. So firstly, the headphone's frequency response curve as measured by a pre-vetted community member. Then secondly, a compensation reference target curve. And then thirdly, but not always, the preset creator's slight preference nudges on that target curve or on the end result. And as of right now, OPRA inside Roon pulls presets from Oratory 1990 as well as something called the Auto EQ repository. Now those Auto EQ presets let us see the frequency response measurement, but not the compensation curve or how it was applied. Now the Oratory 1990 presets do tell us about the target curve in play, and I emphatically prefer the sound of the Sony MDR7506 with Oratory 1990's OPRA preset turned on, but other MDR7506 owners might prefer a different preset, or some of them might even prefer no preset at all. Now with other headphones, I think the improvements are more subtle than they are with the Sony. So for example, Sennheiser's IE300 in-ear monitor, I think actually they are a fantastic match with the Asus Zenfone 10's 3.5mm headphone socket. I don't know why they sound so good, but they do. But I still like to activate Crinical's IE300 EQ preset inside OPRA inside Roon, because it sounds slightly livelier in the uppermost treble than, say, I think it's called SuperView's preset, which, I mean, it sounds nice, but I don't like it as much as Crinical's. So if we see the IE300 as a meal, we're not radically changing its ingredients or its fundamental flavor. We are simply, we're just adding some seasoning. Now, Bluetooth headphones are also part of the Opera project. So we find EQ presets for most models, if not the very latest. So you should pull up Kazi's preset if you want more zip and zing from the Sony WF-1000XM5, but you would choose Oratory 1990's EQ preset for a less energetic sound. Now, on the one hand, I am concerned that Opera further cements the idea that a headphone's frequency response is the only measurement that matters. Because any headphone that internalizes more than one driver will have a time domain behavior that really isn't being considered here, I don't think. But then again, I'm not a measurement expert. So if you do measure headphones for a living, maybe you could clarify this for us. But on the other hand, those concerns about frequency response tunnel vision are overridden by Opera being bigger than Roon. Because yes, Roon Labs set up the Opera project, but it doesn't own it. It has been designed as a distribution point for these headphone presets for anyone to use. So those presets are distributed by Opera under a Creative Commons license. So there is no licensing fee. And so, for example, Plex could put Opera inside PlexAmp without dropping a dime beyond its own software development costs, and so too could JPlay or Audivana or Fubar. So I ask you, who wouldn't want to try to improve the sound of their favorite headphones with a couple of clicks inside an app? And I think it's a question whose simplicity tells you why Opera in Roon is my third hi-fi, actually really it's head-fi, isn't it, product of 2024. Now we come to my overall product of the year, and that is the FiiO R9, which was actually announced, I think, in the last couple of weeks of December in 2023, but it came after my last best of video, so it still qualifies. And if you've never seen this kind of product before, think of it as a smartphone that's been built out with a very good DAC and a THX headphone amplifier. And if you've already seen FiiO's R7, think of the R9 as the R7 on steroids. So the R9 isn't only a streaming DAC, it's a powerful headphone amplifier which gives us up to, I think, 7.3 watts via its single-ended and balanced sockets. So there's a 1/4 inch on the front, there's a 4.4mm balanced and an XLR balanced on the front. And the power we get for headphones from the R9 is almost double that of the R7. And you won't get anywhere near that kind of power from a WIM Ultra. Now, in Lisbon in January and February of this year, I first used the R9 as a loudspeaker system DAC. So the R9, like the cheaper R7, runs any streaming app you care to install from the Google Play Store. I cannot emphasize this enough. We get the Google Play Store on this device, which we don't get from Hi-Fi Rose or Eversolo. So we are not limited to those manufacturers' whitelists of apps. We can install any streaming app we want at any time. We don't have to wait for them to develop their own. Nor do we have to worry about side-loading apps onto our device that aren't on that whitelist, or worry about how those side-loaded apps will scale to an ultra-wide screen display. Because remember, the R9's touchscreen is like your phone's touchscreen. And it's a little bit bigger, I think, than the R7's. But the R9's blingier casework means you'll want to keep a microfiber cloth to hand at all times, especially when you're using it on the desktop, because you're kind of always hands-on with it. But in my Lisbon office, I had the R9 sit on a table next to my listening chair and stream to its dedicated Roon ready input. But then I also used the Tidal app and the Apple Music app and very occasionally the Spotify app. But I can also use the Roon app on this device to stream to other Roon ready devices downstairs. I'm not talking about here downstairs, I'm talking about in Lisbon downstairs. So with the R9 back downstairs in my living room, I had to get off the couch like an animal and get hands-on with its touchscreen to ensure the bit-perfect handling of Apple Music streams. And I gotta say, that became a bit tiresome after a while, so I fell back to pushing Apple Music streams from my TV into the R9's HDMI ARC socket, which the R7 does not have. Now, the Apple TV itself won't do high res, it only does 44.1 and 48 kilohertz. But the TV will resample everything it receives from the Apple TV box, and it resamples everything to 48 kilohertz. So in using the HDMI ARC input for Apple Music, we don't get high res, we don't even get bit perfect playback. Now, the DAC circuit in the R9 is built around a pair of ESS Labs 9030 chips, and that might be why it sounds more tonally colourful and better separated than the R7, which uses a different DAC chip. I've forgotten which one right now. But no, the R9 doesn't sound quite as smooth as Eversolo's DMP A8, but neither is it as costly. And the A8 doesn't do headphones at all, and its screen is horizontal, and there's no Google Play Store. So my only R9 niggle really is that it's stuck on Android 10, and it has yet to make the jump to Android 12 that FiiO promised us at the very start of this year. Now, whether the R9 is worth the extra cash to you over the R7 will depend on your relationship to $700, because that's the price difference between the two models. So you might decide to go for the R9 for functional reasons, because yes, the R9 shares the same coax and Toslink outputs as the R7, but its USB input has been improved. And what they've done here, what FiiO have done, is they've given that USB input its own XMOS chip to handle all the incoming signals, because on the R7, everything was done by one single, I think, system on a chip. And the advantage of having an XMOS chip instead of a system on a chip is that we no longer get lip sync lag over USB. And obviously I confirmed this was also the case for the HDMI ARC input. But the absence of a system on a chip handling the digital inputs also extends to the Bluetooth input. So that's now handled by a dedicated chip, and it now supports various flavors of aptX on top of AAC and LDAC. And the R9 comes with a Bluetooth remote that's a paid extra for the R7. But neither the supplied Bluetooth remote control nor FiiO's screen mirroring app, which I think is a little bit laggy, could pull me back to the device after it had been placed on a low board between the speakers. So me here, it's over there. So I only really enjoy getting hands-on with the R9 when it's within arm's reach. So for the past month or so, I've had the R9 sat on top of a small table next to my couch. It's just here, right next to the right arm of my couch. And that's a little bit like the setup I have in my Lisbon office. But this time around, here in Berlin, I've installed Roon Arc. So can you see where I'm going with this? Yep, headphone EQ. Now, even though Arc doesn't seem to be bit perfect on the R9, the Focal Stellia sound less boxy in the mid-range with Oratory 1990's OPRA preset than without. But if you don't like Oratory 1990's preset, you still have 4 more different presets to choose from. And this reminds me of my recent follow-up video about the KEF Q Concerto Meta. And in that video, I asked, what is that speaker's true sound? I was talking about the differences between amplifiers. Here, I'm talking about the differences between headphone correction. So we could ask here, what is the true corrected voice of the Focal Stellia? Or is the true voice the uncorrected version? I don't know. But after spending some time with OPRA applied to the Focal closebacks, I gotta say, it's hard to go back to them in stock form. It really is. I much prefer to have them DSP corrected. And that stock form sound, so no DSP correction, is what we get when we're listening to music from Apple Music or the Tidal app or the Spotify app or the Plexamp app, at least for now. So instead of going back and slumming it with those apps, I chose to move to a completely different headphone, one that isn't yet listed in OPRA, and that's the 105 Air from Meze. So as far as I know, no other streaming DAC marries a vertical screen to an Android operating system for Google Play Store access to effectively Roon Arc and OPRA's headphone EQ. I can't think of another streaming DAC that can do this. And that for me is reason enough to peg the R9 along with its many other possible use cases as product of the year for 2024. Anyway, if you like this video, you know what to do, and hit us up on Patreon for playlists and exclusive video content. And thank you ever so much for watching. The MIAD-01, of course, it wouldn't be a modern day, well, as long as the lighting is decent anyway, but for anyone still rocking, going old school, but for anyone still rocking, so going old school with a card or micro, because the MIAD-01, 2212. Now an extensive Campfire IEM collection. And as Darko audio podcaster, now Cortini told me, and both the Solaris and the, so park that thought because we're coming, and as I said about the Meze, but the R9's blingier casework, it's kind of like a mirror really, isn't it? From my TV into the R9's HDMI socket, but neither is it, but neither the supplied Bluetooth, but neither the, so Arc doesn't seem to, but if you don't like that preset, then you have 4 more to choose from.